combat effectiveness left. So now it is just stuck in the Red Sea, not knowing where to go. Well, whatever. That is just how it is. All right, that is enough chit chat. Let us get down to business.
All right, let us talk about Cuba. First off, we need to be clear about one thing. This is just a stalling tactic. Right now, a lot of people are saying that Cuba has surrendered. So what is their evidence for that? They say that Cuban officials have come out and said, we will allow foreign investment, right? And that they are letting us investigators come ashore. Plus, they have been in talks with the US all along. So what is the deal? They are out there bragging every day about how many conditions they have set. But honestly, I do not think we can say that Cuba has surrendered at this stage. Because at the end of the day, it is a negotiation. And negotiating just means they are still talking. So about this whole thing of allowing foreign investment and setting up 100% wholly owned subsidiaries, it is hard to say who that really benefits. If Cuba really does allow foreign investment and lets companies set up 100% wholly owned subsidiaries, well, it is not a given that American companies would actually benefit from that. As for that investigation, the one into the speedboat incident, the story was that they were allowing the US FBI to come in and investigate. Actually, the full statement at the time was this. They would allow US FBI personnel to participate in the investigation of the speedboat incident, cooperating with Cuba's Ministry of the Interior to determine what happened. So yeah, that is basically the exact original wording. Those were the exact words, word for word. All right. So besides that, on the speedboat, there were 10 armed individuals, 4 were killed and 6 were injured, 4 dead, 6 wounded. So 10 Americans, 4 dead, 6 wounded. So after the Secretary of State got the report, what did he say? He said, I have been briefed by the Cubans. No US government personnel were involved. Now, sure, they are Americans, but they are not with our US government. So when you ask who is caving or who is backing down, I think we need to wait and see. For these things, you really have to look at the facts, not get sidetracked by other issues, and just see how the situation develops. And when it comes to revolution, there are many ways to fight. Negotiating is a form of struggle. Being duplicitous is a form of struggle. And even stalling for time is a form of struggle. I mean, look at us. We went from the Red Army straight to the National Army back in the day, did not we? I mean, the 18th Group Army, the 8th Route Army, the New 4th Army, were not they all part of the National Army, right? They were the real deal. The most legitimate part of the National Army were not they. They reported directly to Chairman Chang of the Military Commission, not to the commander of any specific war zone. At the very beginning, it was clearly stated in the agreement. It was Chairman Chang himself who said, I, Chairman Chang, will personally lead you. So they were the most loyal of the loyal, right? And you see, a huge proportion of them were Huangpu cadets. So, later on, did not we also have the military mediation group with the US? And the KMT had one too. Hey, I think when it comes to negotiations, it is just another form of struggle. So let us not jump to conclusions so quickly. And especially, I am begging you guys, really for those of you who see Cuba as this beacon of revolution, this utopia, please, I am asking you, do not go from we are winning to we have lost this fast. Hey, do not just assume Cuba is done for and immediately jump ship and think that imperialism has already won, then immediately start showing off how you are its most loyal lapdog. Please do not do that. That is just ridiculous. All right. But with that said, what can we take away from all this for Cuba? How did it get to this point? What did it do? Right? Shout out to Mo Yu De, run for the renewal. Appreciate it. So how did they get to this point? What did they do right? And what did they do wrong? Regarding the US sanctions, right? First off, a lot of people say, and I need to make this point very clear, Cuba's economic difficulties are undeniably linked to the brutal economic sanctions imposed by the US for 60 years. And that is a crucial reason. But it is not the only reason why Cuba is facing its current situation. The decisive factor in the development of anything is always internal, not external. So for Cuba, I believe its biggest problem is in fact internal. Oh, and thanks to Wajiao Zaijia for renewing their captain subscription for 522 days. Thank you so much. And that is our 8th captain today. See, it all comes down to internal factors. You talk about sanctions and blockades, but what about when they were in the socialist camp, back when they had the Soviet Union's support? They did not have any problems selling their stuff or importing what they needed. So for over 60 years, you could say that many of Cuba's import problems, its inability to bring in certain goods, are due to the US blockade. And the reason their economic dealings are not going so smoothly, it is because of the US blockade. But now, Cuba is even short on bread, right? They are short on bread, flour, and sugar too. And you are a sugar-producing nation, but you are short on sugar and salt too. Are you going to blame that on the US blockade as well? A country with flat terrain where people eat bread, yet it has no flour. This country, Once the world's largest sugar producer, responsible for 20% of the global supply, does not even have a functioning independent sugar industry. As an island nation, you are short on salt and fresh fish. Can you really say that is all because of the US sanctions? Is everything really the fault of the US sanctions? Because in the more than 60 years that Cuba has been under US sanctions, it still has not managed to build up an industry that can at least provide its own people with, well, salt, table salt. They have not figured out how to create an internal circulation system for these basic things, like seasonings and fish. And that, I think, is definitely something worth thinking about. Yeah, as we have mentioned before, Cuba's industries, well, their indices have been shrinking incredibly fast. It has been a massive decline. All right, so here is a chart. If you look at the very top here, you can see the sugar industry back in 1990. Its index was 110. But then by 2005, the index for the sugar industry had plummeted to just 17%. And by 2022, what was the index for the paper industry down to? It was down to just 7%. Just 7. It plummeted from 110 all the way down to 7. That is a drop of over 95%. We have talked about this before, have not we? Right? So over a decade, it plummets by 40%, something like that. So why did it crash so badly? And that is because, you see, even in the more than 60 years since its socialist revolution, Cuba has never managed to break free from its dependence on major powers. All right, let us take Cuba's sugar industry as an example. The history of its sugarcane industry is a really long one. During the Spanish colonial era, it was dependent on its mother country. Because, Cuba's native fruits and vegetables and fish, which were not suitable for long voyages back to Europe. As for the local crops, like cassava and taro, well, there was no market for them in Europe. And as the colonial power, Spain also banned the colonies from growing cotton, wheat, or rice. Cuba's agricultural regions are quite flat, and the climate is hot, so sugarcane can be grown all year round. So, sugarcane was a crop where they had a comparative advantage. This turned Cuba into the sugar base for the Spanish Empire. All right, so after more than a century of development, by the early 20th century, the US had become the largest consumer of Cuban sugar. So in 1898, Cuba started a rebellion to drive out the Spanish. So the US jumped into the war using the excuse of helping Cuba gain its independence. And just like that, the Spanish-American War broke out. Then, in December, Spain surrendered to the United States and transferred Cuba's sovereignty over to them. And in 1898, the US officially established a military occupation in Cuba. From that point on, Cuba's sugar industry was dominated by Americans. A staggering 95% of the shares in the sugar industry's capital were held by US citizens. By 1943, the US had even gone so far as to buy up all of Cuba's sugar production for that year and ship it all back to the States. So for a very long time, for about 50 or 60 years, actually for nearly 70 years, the US was Cuba's main investor and consumer market. As a result, it completely controlled the country's political situation. So, from 1902 to 1958, Cuba was a true banana republic. So on paper, it was an independent republic, but in reality, it was completely controlled by the United States, operating under a constitution written for it by the US Congress. So during this period, Cuba went from being a Spanish sugarcane base to what? It became an American sugarcane base. It's not their plotline, just like this in Red Dead Redemption. They would run off to some island, right? And that island produced the sugar, blah, blah, blah. Well, that is obviously Cuba. It's not it. All right. So in 1959, the Cuban Revolution was victorious, and Castro went ahead with nationalization. Then, in 1960, Eisenhower imposed a sugar embargo on Cuba. And right at that moment, the Soviet Union stepped in. The Soviets came forward and bought up all the Cuban sugar that the US refused to purchase. And this right here was a pivotal moment in Cuban history. So after the Soviet Union bought up all that sugar, on one hand, so for Cuba, so the leadership, they doubled down on the socialist path. And just like that, they successfully exported all that surplus sugarcane after losing the US market. All right, on the other hand, they also received technical and material support from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. All right, so at this point, it is not like Cuba was not holding its own. It is not that they were not. In fact, Castro really stepped up his game at this time. So his thinking at the time was, I started out dependent on the US, then I became dependent on the Soviet Union, but I cannot stay dependent on the Soviets forever. I want to be independent, to stand on my own 2 feet. This was to eliminate the shocks to the national economy caused by being dependent on a single commodity. So right after Castro took power,
he was not a big fan of exporting cane sugar. So in Cuba, starting in 1961, they began trying to change their trade structure, right, to reduce their reliance on sugar exports. In terms of agriculture, we are saying, all right, the whole island of Cuba should not just be planting sugarcane. We should plant what we need for food, and we should plant fruit. I want to create a self-sufficient internal cycle. So in agriculture, they push for diversified crops, aiming for self-sufficiency. Then, on the industrial front, they also invested heavily in importing equipment, to quickly establish their iron and steel metallurgy industry. And the sectors like textiles, chemicals, and petroleum, they pursued an import substitution strategy to reduce their reliance on foreign industrial goods. They imported massive amounts of machinery and equipment. And the construction did proceed at a very fast pace during Castro's first 3 years, establishing some basic steel. So, in the metallurgy and chemical sectors, because of this shift in where the money was being invested, over these few years, Cuba's sugarcane production, it plummeted from 96.9 million tons in 1961 to just 3.8 million tons in 1963, a 45% drop. And by 1964, the value of Cuba's sugar exports had indeed dropped to just 15% of its GDP. Right, so Castro's plan was to reduce sugar exports. So this strategy of fostering other economic growth points, you cannot say it was a total failure. But, well, it only worked halfway. So, while it is true that sugar exports did go down, industrialization, that never really took off. And why? Because Cuba's economic foundation was just too weak. Industrialization requires massive investment and long-term capital accumulation. After you have built up that foundation, you can then scale up your industries and the products you manufacture. So, within the same time frame, if your labor productivity is high, the products you make will be cheaper, better, and more competitive. But what if you try to build just a little bit of that import substitution type of industry? This import substitution strategy has failed in the vast majority of Latin American countries. And why is that? Because if you're only setting up a small-scale industry, what does it rely on? It relies entirely on state subsidies. Right, because with that approach, the whole point of your industry is to replace imports. So you are only catering to the domestic market. Their industries are geared towards the entire global market for massive exports. No matter what, the stuff they produce will be cheaper, better quality, and updated faster than yours. So for Latin American countries, when they try this import substitution strategy, the products coming out of the factories they set up just cannot compete with imports, no matter what, right? Without competition, if your products are not competitive, no one is going to buy them. So they still need government subsidies. So what did this lead to? Well, these efforts at self-reliance ironically made Cuba's foreign trade situation even more dire. By 1963, Cuba's trade deficit had surged and its foreign exchange reserves dwindled. And this equipment you rushed to build in just 3 years. It is not even turning a profit yet, is it? So you have put all this money in, but you have not even broken even yet. So what does this lead to? Well, the production of our agricultural and sideline products has no financial backing, and neither does the import of industrial raw materials. The only option left is to cut back on food. Supply cannot keep up with demand. Factories are running below capacity, and an economic crisis starts to emerge, right? This is a classic case of incurring high economic cost while also facing severe economic hardship. All right, so at this point, let us say it were us. We were facing such severe economic hardship. So what happened next? Well, we just kept on this path, gritting our teeth to build up that self-sufficient internal economic cycle. But Cuba, they went from one extreme to the other in a flash. So what was their solution? Well, they pivoted to accumulating capital through massive exports of cane sugar in an attempt to achieve industrialization. Right. Then, after 1964, the US tightened its blockade on Cuba. The Johnson administration, in particular, completely banned the sale of medicine and food to the island. So naturally, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and other socialist countries. So after that last attempt at industrialization and economic diversification failed, the Castro government realized, hey, we are actually broke, are not we? To achieve industrialization, I need to accumulate capital. So how do I do that? Well, I have to leverage the comparative advantage of cane sugar again. I would just take these agricultural raw materials and semi-processed goods, sell them and get the money back. So problem solved, right? Now I can build up my industry. And so they went all in on massively expanding their sugar exports. All right. So fast forward to 1972, they joined the CMEA, receiving economic aid from the Soviet Union, enjoying trade preferences and getting economic subsidies. And it was designated as a CMEA's supplier of cane sugar. All right. And this is when the good times began for Cuba. So during the Cold War, even before Cuba joined the CMEA, the Soviet Union had always signed agreements with them to buy sugar at prices above the market rate. So every few years, we would sign a long-term supply agreement, and the price was guaranteed to be higher than the market rate. So within the socialist bloc, Cuba did not have to worry about playing ball with American capitalists just to sell its sugar. Plus, they could sell their entire sugar output at a preferential price, higher than the world market rate. to this guaranteed market. So out of the millions of tons of sugar produced each year after what was distributed to our own people in Cuba through the ration books, and the rest, it all went to the Eastern Bloc, all the Eastern European countries. And to be honest, the Soviet Union really did need its sugar. I mean, Russian cuisine, right? It is always full of pastries, so sweet, they are almost sickening. I mean, those big loaves of bread are just covered in a layer of frosting, and so on and so forth. They use sugar for everything. So they really, really needed it. And they would buy it all up. In return, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries would provide them with oil, cheap oil, sugarcane harvesting machinery, and all the mechanized equipment for sugar production. So you have got a market, high prices, a stable buyer, right? Plus you get the machinery and all the guarantees. So as for things like, technological upgrades, improving productivity or boosting competitiveness, well, all that motivation just was not there. But hey, that money from Big Brother Soviet Union, it was not exactly a free lunch. And the US's role in the Soviet-led system of international division of labor. So, in line with the requirements for integration and specialization within the Soviet Socialist bloc, what was Cuba supposed to develop? The production of agricultural and mineral products like cane sugar, tropical fruits, tobacco, and nickel. And what is even worse? According to the protocol on planning which the Soviet Union and Cuba signed every 10 years, before Cuba could make any economic development plans, they first had to coordinate with the Soviet Union's 5-year plans and all its other plans. So, Cuba's economy at that time, it was basically like a county or a state or a province of the Soviet Union. Its plans had to be coordinated with the Soviet Union's. And this was the case for all the Eastern European countries. They all had to coordinate their plans with the central production directives issued by the Soviet Union's Planning Commission. Every single economic sector had to coordinate with its counterpart in the Soviet Union to figure out how they would cooperate over the next 10 years. And so after these discussions, so it was pretty obvious, right? The Soviet Union figured your only competitive industries were cane sugar, nickel, agriculture, and mining. So they told you to just stick to those. You just accept the grand division of labor within the socialist family of nations. You cannot make this, you cannot make that. You have got no oil, no alternative energy sources, and no coal being shipped to you. Right? You ramp up your sugarcane production, and then you trade that with us for what you need. We are all part of one unified, massive market. Well, not a market, but a unified grand plan. So, under these circumstances, Castro had no choice but to focus more and more on expanding sugarcane production to meet the needs of the entire socialist world, the socialist camp. By 1970, Cuba's sugar production had already shattered its previous record, hitting 10 million tons. That is how high it got. For such a small country to produce 10 million tons of sugar. At the 1971 National Sugar Production Conference, while Castro was still emphasizing, the sugar industry held an unshakable, dominant position in the nation's industrial sector. We had our own slogans, like steel as the killing and grain as the killing. So what was theirs? It was sugar as the killing, right? And what did that lead to? This came, sugar, right? It further solidified and expanded this kind of mono economy. Did not. It is pretty obvious. So from 1971 to 1975, Cuba's average sugar production was about 5 to 6 million tons. Then from 1976 to the 1980s, it was around 7 million tons. And from 1981 to 85, it was about 7.7 million tons. The entire country, you see, became a sugar jar for the gold exchange standard. Every industry, including agriculture, was structured to produce more sugarcane and more sugar. So, by 1979, let us look back. In 1964, cane sugar made up 15% of Cuba's total exports. So, like I said, by 1979, what percentage of Cuba's total exports was sugar? It reached 84%, and in 1980, it was 86%. Almost 90%. A country where 90% of all exports is just sugar, what does that even mean? So, to put it bluntly, your entire country is basically just a sugar bowl pretending to be a nation, right? And before the Soviet Union collapsed, that figure stayed consistently above 75%. And the Soviet Union, in turn, replaced the US as Cuba's largest market for its sugar exports. So what does that lead to? Cuba went from being a dependent of the US to a dependent of who? It became a dependent state of the Soviet Union. From 1961 to 1976, the proportion of Cuban sugar exports to the Soviet Union was as high as 45%, nearly half. Then there were other Eastern European countries, a bit from here and there, some from Africa, and a little from China. That was pretty much it. And this proportion kept steadily rising right up until the collapse of the Soviet bloc, just before the great upheaval in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So what was the plan? The idea was I export this sugar, right? Accumulate some capital, and then use it to develop my own domestic industries. But as they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
as the saying goes, every gift from fate has its price tag, does not it? It is just hidden in the fine print. The Soviet Union would import massive amounts of Cuban sugar, essentially buying up the entire harvest. At the same time, the Soviet Union also required Cuba to import large quantities of its industrial goods. So anything Cuba was short on, they imported from the Soviet Union over 90% of their petroleum, cotton, pig iron, coal, and flour. 90% of their flour was imported from the Soviet Union. So think about it. Some of you were just asking, why is there no fertilizer? No fertilizer. Well, let me ask you this. Could the US embargo stop the Soviet Union from shipping fertilizer to Cuba? The Soviet Union accounted for 7% of Cuba's trade, but over 70% of its fertilizer was imported from them. Trucks, cars, tractors all came from the Soviet Union. All these essential means of production for Cuba's sugar industry, they all came from the Soviet Union. Just to think about it, what are you? You are exporting primary products while importing mid to high-end goods. And on top of that, they had to import all their food. So what does this all lead to? Cuba's been exporting for ages. So not only did they fail to accumulate any capital, but what happened instead? A trade deficit. And that trade deficit just kept growing. And growing. Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, that guy with the beard, he basically treated Cuba like one of the Soviet republics, just messing it up. Yeah, exactly. And from 1960 to 1989, Cuba's annual trade deficit with the Soviet Union was 8.5 billion rubles. That is 8.5 billion rubles every single year. And that was with the Soviets subsidizing it. Without Soviet aid, Cuba's trade deficit would have been 3 times larger, reaching around 25 to 30 billion rubles. So, the Cuban Revolution, its goal was to break free from dependence on the United States. But by implementing this comparative development strategy, instead of firmly pursuing a path of self-reliance, what did they do instead? This actually increased Cuba's dependence on foreign trade. Now, let us take a look at this chart that I found in a research paper. And this table, I think, is pretty authoritative. Look here. This is Cuba's trade dependence on the members of the Jinhu Conference. It has been rising year after year, right? It was basically hovering around the 80% mark, which is incredibly high. All right, so because of this complete, it is not even, hey, thanks to Blazing Flame for joining the crew. Welcome aboard, new captain. Thank you. There is this kind of complete, and it is not even on a national scale. This purely planned, highly. I mean, look, when you talk about a planned economy, at least it is within a single country. Right, take us, for example. Even within a single country, our planned economy still cultivated a huge number of, under the planned economy system, it cultivated a whole generation of managerial, planning, and economic cadres. Right. Right. Their planned economy was not just on a national scale. It was a unified, top-down planned economy spanning the entire world, the entire socialist bloc. So what does all this lead to? Cuba has very few economic officials. For 60 or 70 years, their economic mindset has been a one-track mind, just sugar. The economy had very little redundancy and was severely lacking in diversity. They were unfamiliar with many new economic sectors. So what did they rely on? They were completely reliant on the division of labor within these foundations, right? Okay, so with the government in that state, what about the spontaneous economic explorations from the Cuban people themselves? Well, those were not allowed either. Actually, Cuba has always maintained this small-scale peasant economy. About 30% of its land has always belonged to these small farmers, while the other 70% is state-owned. So, as early as 1980, some people in Cuba, some of the more perceptive ones, felt that this approach just was not going to work. We have got to make some reforms. We cannot have 90% of our food, 90% of our flour, all coming from the Soviet Union. That is just not sustainable. So how do you boost agricultural production and diversify it into other crops? And this was implemented nationwide. And then they set up these peasant-free markets. What that means is, after farmers have fulfilled their mandatory delivery quotas to the state, you have a private plot of land. So you could, plant some vegetables, some fruits or whatever, and then take them out to sell the surplus produce. So for agriculture, that is a goal. The idea was to give farmers a little incentive and boost the output of the farming and livestock sectors. But after this went on for 6 years, by May of 1986, but of course, the workers on the state-owned lands, well, they were not too happy about that, were they? I mean, look at them. They have been selling ducks, chickens, and fruit for 6 years, and every single one of them has gotten rich. These small farmers have all prospered. And were not we the ones working on the state farms back in the day? I mean, think about it. They were dirt poor, were not they? So now it is like joining the revolution early is worse than joining late. And joining late is worse than not joining at all. Can you imagine? This is just outrageous, right? So this news eventually got back to Castro. So Castro, he was thinking this growing wealth gap, it is not something you can just smooth over, right? So what is the plan? So fast forward to May 1986. They went and shut down the free market.
Yep.
They brought back the state's system of unified purchase and sale. This involved implementing a highly centralized agricultural production strategy, which also included strengthening the state's monopoly on foreign trade. So what is the point of this unified purchase and sale system? So what they did was just take those private plots and turn them into state-run farms, right? Exactly. This means their economy was still single-tracked with very little redundancy. This was their last chance. And what happened? By the 1990s, the Soviet bloc had dramatically changed and the Soviet Union collapsed. This long-standing single-minded trade policy. And on top of that, there was Cuba's sugar, which was heavily dependent on long-term, 10-year plus supply agreements with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe through the CMEA. I mean, who was going to buy it? So, you can imagine the economy was hit with a devastating blow. Of course, at the same time, the US under the Bush administration decided to kick them while they were down. They seized this opportunity to try and subvert Cuba's socialist regime. And then in 1992, they went ahead and tightened the trade embargo on Cuba to curb Cuba's economic development. Actually, it was the Bush administration that really started to seriously damage Cuba's economy right after the Gulf War in 1992. So, with its political and economic lifelines gone, Cuba's imports of oil, food, and pesticides plummeted. As a result, in 1990, so take a look at this chart here, from 1990 to 1993, the Cuban economy took a nosedive, the gross national product. A cumulative drop of 40%, and total foreign trade plummeted by 75%. See, that's 75%. That was the cane sugar they were exporting to the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. So now, with exports gone, poof, 75% vanished. What about imports, you ask? Well, if there are no exports, where is the money for imports going to come from? And imports, they plummeted from $8 billion to just $2 billion. Cuba's army was downsized from 180,000 to just 60,000 troops, a reduction of 2/3. It is like the entire army was wiped out without ever firing a single shot. And at the same time, they were expected to maintain their combat readiness. So to ease the burden on the state, these 60,000 soldiers had to become self-sufficient through production. And in the end, the entire Cuban military achieved a food self-sufficiency rate of 80%. So how much time do you think these soldiers spent farming and producing versus training? And how well did that even work out? It was only then, facing such a severe crisis, that the PCC, the Communist Party of Cuba, finally came to its senses. So they proposed an open door policy, realizing they could not just rely on foreign aid to achieve industrialization. They had to pursue self-reliance. At the very least, they had to figure out a way to find substitutes for the